Novel, The Great Fire of London. Chapter 1, The Baker's Spark. London never slept so much as turned from one ache to another. Even after midnight, carts clattered along the river stairs, tavern shutters banged, and voices, merchants bargaining in half-whispers, sailors laughing too loud, spilled through the seams of crooked houses. The Thames breathed in the dark below like a slow animal, its water licking the wharf pilings, carrying scents of fish, tar, and rot up the lanes. In Pudding Lane, where the street narrowed to a seam between leaning timber fronts, Thomas Farrier raked the last crescent of coals beneath his oven. The heat came off it in steady breaths, warm enough that a man could pretend the world was kind. He wiped flour from his forearms and peered into the mouth of the brick dome, judging it by the colour only a baker can read, not the screaming white of a day's bake, not the dull red of sleep, but a fierce orange that would keep the morning's first batch quick and obedient. "Bank it," he said without turning. "Not too thin, there's a draught tonight." "Yes, master," Ellen answered. She was small, quick-handed, a maid with flour dusting the downy hairs at her temples. The wind talked in the chimney, a hollow note that made her shoulders lift. She reached for the iron peel, testing its weight the way her master did, and dragged embers into a mound like a small glowing hill. Sparks skittered across the hearthstone and died. Farrier counted money by candlelight at the table, halfpennies for the apprentices, shillings for the flourman who would arrive before dawn, a reckoning with the widow from Thames Street who owed for 2 loaves last week and had not appeared since. His hands were cleverer with dough than coin. The world beyond oven and market rents, warrants, the Lord Mayor's men felt distant and unreasonable. "Bank it," he repeated, softer now, because the sound of the wind had reached him too. Ellen set the peel aside and latched the iron door. Heat leaked out around it like breath from a tight mouth. She stood a moment, listening. From somewhere down by the river came the thud of a cask rolled to a boat and a man's voice calling prices. Somewhere above, a rat ticked in the rafters, the smallest of feet scratching lines in the night. "You'll lock the shop," Farrier said. "And the back door. Take the lantern. Mind the stairs." She took the lantern and turned the wick low. Its flame answered with a wag of yellow light. In the shop, the air was cooler, the day's loaves had gone out long ago, and only a stingy smell of rye and yeast clung to the counters. She slid the bolts, checked the shutter of the street window, and paused, palm pressed to timber. The wind pushed back. She imagined, as she did most nights, the far-off noises rearranging themselves into meaning. The clop of a late horse might be soldiers, there was always talk of soldiers since the wars on the sea. The scrape of hull against hull could be thieves, or a corpse caught among the piles, nudging wood with a dreadful politeness. It was nothing, it was London. She drew her hand away, making a small cross in the air as her mother had taught her. When she returned to the bakehouse, Farrier had set the coins aside and taken off his apron. He rubbed at a flour streak on his cheek and looked older for a moment, lines kneaded into his face by years of keeping heat and time in harness. "You've a good ear," he said, almost to himself. "Feels like an east wind. Bad for bread. Bad for everything. Will it blow the oven out?" "Not with that door shut." He glanced at the iron again, the latch firm, the seam bright. "We'll be fine." They climbed the narrow stairs together. The tread had a bend in it where generations of feet had worn an easy place. On the landing, Ellen lifted her lantern to light Farrier's door and then the little room above where she slept beneath the roof. He paused, hand on his latch, and nodded to her, some half-gruff gesture that held affection like a coin secreted in a fist. "Sleep," he said. "We rise by 4. "Yes, master." He went in and shut his door. Ellen climbed one more flight, counting in her head as she always did 1, 2, 3 to the stained patch of wall that looked like a map, 4, 5, 6 to the beam that always made her duck, 7, 8 to the door. She set the lantern on her stool and undressed quickly, gooseflesh rising along her arms. The roof timbers were close enough overhead that she could touch them. She lay down, pulled the blanket to her chin, and watched the lantern's flame rub its light along the underside of the rafters. Below, in the bakehouse, the oven settled. Bricks creaked as they traded heat with the night. A coal that had hidden itself in the rim where dome met floor cinched tighter, its skin turning from orange to the color of a cat's eye. The iron door, hot as a tongue, expanded into its latch, then eased back as the draft teased under it. In the street, a watchman called the hour and the weather in a sing-song that drifted down lanes and under doors, past 1 o'clock, and a fair wind from the east. Ellen closed her eyes. She had a way of sleeping that looked like prayer, hands folded, face turned toward the wall. The lantern dwindled to a pin, then to a smell of spent wick. She dreamed of fields she had not seen since she was a child, of bread that sprang under her hand, of her mother's laugh. In the middle of the dream a noise climbed like a ladder through the house, a soft ticking that in her sleep she made into rain. It was not rain. It was the chatter of sparks. In the bakehouse, a splinter lay in the ash at the oven's mouth, no larger than a child's finger. It had fallen earlier from a bundle of kindling and been kicked without notice under the table leg. Heat washed across it now in patient waves. The first thin curl of smoke rose and disappeared. Then another, thicker. The splinter darkened like a lie that had been told once too often and began to remember it was wood. A rat dropped from the beams, paused, whiskers tasting the air, and darted across the floorboards toward a sack of flour leaning in the corner. The sack made a hump of pale cloth, tied with a rag. The rat worried at it and fled as a small ember, no bigger than a seed, skittered from the hearth and came to rest against the rag. The house breathed. The ember reddened. The rag's edge browned, then crisped. A thread glowed like a vein lit from within. The ember died. The thread held its red a heartbeat longer, then let it go. A silence like the space between cough and cough filled the room. Upstairs, Farina rolled onto his side. His dream turned a lane into a loaf into a child's face, his own child long gone to marriage and other streets. He woke half, listening through the boards the way bakers do, ears tuned to weight and settling, and thought he heard the scrape of a loose shutter. He told his knees he was too old to go down again, and they agreed and held him where he lay. Below, the seam beneath the oven door gleamed. The draught the master had warned of found itself a path, thin as a blade, under the iron and over the hearthstone, and licked the little hill of banked coals. They answered with a gentle brightening, as if someone had told them a joke. Heat rose. The splinter in the ash became a coal. The rag tied round the flour sack sighed into a small, secret flame that hid inside its own smoke. It climbed slow as a lyre up the edge of the sack. Cloth darkened, retreated, advanced. Where the rag bound, the flame grew fat. It reached the flour, found no fuel there. Meal does not burn the way a man's fear stories say, but the sack's outer threads offered themselves one by one, and the flame took them with the dainty appetite of a thief. On the second floor, the corridor had acquired a smell. It was not the homely, rich perfume of oven heat that filled mornings. It was sharper, a clean knife of scent that searched the nose and made the mouth water with unease. It found Ellen first. She frowned in her sleep and turned her face into the blanket. The smell followed. Outside, the wind shouldered up the lane, pushing at shutters, worrying the thatch down the way, ringing the signboards until they creaked like old shoulders. It found the tiny leaks in every house and reminded each door and hinge that it had been made by imperfect hands. The watchman came back along the far end of Pudding Lane, his staff tapping, his voice lazier now, past 2:00 the clock. He stopped to piss against a post, humming to himself. When he turned, the air ahead was darker than it should have been. He squinted. No, he had imagined it. The night was a treacherous partner. He lifted his lantern and held it high, saw only the familiar pressed faces of houses leaning into one another as if conferring. He moved on. In the bakehouse, the flame left the sack and found the broom propped beside it. Straw took like gossip, sudden, eager. Fire put out a new hand to touch the leg of the table, then the rushes strewn on the floor, then the hem of an apron thrown careless over the chair. Heat piled on heat. Sap that had slept inside the table's grain since it was a tree woke with soft pops. Ellen sat up. The smell was personality now, not mere presence. It climbed into her nose and sat there, grinning. She swung her legs from the bed and yelped as her bare feet met a floor too warm for a night that cold. The yelp was small, swallowed by the house, but below the oven door the coals answered with a brighter breath as if pleased to be acknowledged. Master, she called, and the word held the old habit of caution. No answer. She snatched up the lantern, thumbed the wick to life, and opened her door. The corridor had a smear of smoke along the ceiling, this delicate grey that would have been beautiful any other night. She ran and beat at Farina's door with the side of her fist. Master. He was up and out at once, eyes still sleeping but body quick. What? Something, she said, and now there was no caution in it. Something's burning. They went down together, the lantern's light hopping before them across the stair like a child on one foot. At the bakehouse door, he smelled it, the hot, sour bite of burning straw, and pushed past her. When he opened the door, heat met them, an embrace too familiar to be polite. The corner by the flour sack was alive. Flames climbed the broom, kissed the apron to ash, and ran laughing across the rushes. For a frozen heartbeat, the baker and the maid stood, and the fire showed them themselves, two figures cut from candlelight and fear. Then he moved. Water. Farina barked, seizing the bucket by the door, already knowing it was empty because he had left it so. He hurled it anyway, a gesture of rage that accomplished nothing but a crash and the answering roar of air into flame. Ellen spun toward the rear yard. The bucket there was heavy and honest with water. She slopped half of it on the stair and did not curse, no breath to waste, and came back with the remainder. He took it, threw, and the fire writhed, white for an instant, then thickened as the draught through the doorway fed it again. The oven, he said, sudden dread. He looked. The iron door was latched, the seam bright. But the heat around it had risen to a new pitch, a sound in the bricks like bees. More, he snapped, and she ran again. Outside, the wind crouched at the threshold and pushed. It sent a handful of sparks out into the shop. One landed on the settling bench and lay there like a thought that would not be dismissed. Upstairs, in the street-facing room, a shutter had not been tight as they believed. A thin finger of fire had found it from below and licked along its underside. It tasted the pitch in the board joints and was encouraged. Ellen came back with more water and with it a ribbon of air that dragged the fire sideways and up the stair. Farrier swore language from a younger man's life and turned his shoulder to it, throwing by feel. Heat hit his face hard enough to take a decade away. He had been a boy once, playing at the kill on a summer day, and this heat was that and more, the same promise and the same threat. Out, he said, not gentle now. Up and out. Wake the neighbors. The watch. Go. She went, lantern banging her thigh, bucket mouth slopping at her ankles. On the stairs, smoke moved with purpose, a beast with its decision made. She held the lantern low and ducked, mouth open, eyes running. At the shop, she dragged the bolts, fought the warped wood, and let the night in. The wind took her breath and made a sail of her apron. Help, she shouted into Pudding Lane, a sound that bent in the wind and ran away down the street. Fire. A window shutter flew back across from her and a man's pale face leaned out, then vanished in the same instant as if the night had struck him. From deeper in the lane, voices erupted, the word passed mouth to mouth faster than any bell. Fire. Below, Farrier threw the last of the water and watched it vanish to steam before it reached the heart of anything. The corner where it had started was a single shout now. The heat pressed him back, pressed the skin at his hands into a tightness that would blister later. He looked at the oven again and put his palm to the iron door, a lunatic test, and snatched it back. The draft had changed its mind. It tore up through the flue like a rope yanked by giants. Somewhere in the stacks above, a sound like laughter beginning to crack in heat. He stepped backward into the shop, coughing. The bench was smoking. He slapped at it with his apron, and his apron caught, and in the second he fought it the stairwell presented a new tongue of flame, bright and nimble. He swore again, louder, not to the fire but to himself because he knew the arithmetic now, and it was not in his favor. In the street, Ellen ran barefoot, the lantern painting wild hands on the walls. Doors opened. Dogs howled. Somewhere a baby started to scream. The watchman came up at a stumbling trot, eyes wide, waving his staff as if at thieves. He saw the glow already pulsing in the bakery windows and forgot the words he usually had for such nights. He turned and ran, bellowing the only word the city hated to hear at that hour, the word that pulled people up from beds and into their clothes and down into the lane with their lives in their arms. Fee-ree, he roared. Fire. Pudding Lane lifted its head, sniffed, understood. And in the bakehouse, the oven, whose heat had fed the street every morning for years, began to speak in its other tongue. The house was not burning, the lane was. The lane was not burning, the city was. The spark had taken hold. Chapter 2, London at midnight. The bells of St. Magnus tolled 2 strokes, and then the sound was swallowed by the wind. The city turned in its uneasy sleep. London was a labyrinth in those days, a forest of crooked streets and timber houses that leaned so close across the lanes they seemed to whisper secrets to one another. Lanterns swung above tavern doors, painting yellow patches on the cobbles. Drunks staggered home with arms slung about each other's necks. Somewhere in the distance a fiddler scraped a reel, the tune dissolving into laughter and a crash of glass. But not all of London kept to merriment. In the yards by Thames Street, dockside men worked by torchlight to haul casks aboard Dutch hulks. The glow from their fires smeared the water red, and the smell of pitch and salt meat drifted upriver. The city breathed commerce, even at this hour, sugar from Barbados, silk from the Levant, wine from France, tallow from Ireland. Wealth stacked in timber warehouses, waiting to be traded. Wealth that would burn like oil if a spark found it. Thomas Gray carried his tools home along Fish Street Hill, his body aching from the day's work. He was 19, but work had carved lines into his shoulders already, and his hands bore the thick scabs of a carpenter's life. His master had taken on extra orders, chests for a merchant, new beams for a counting house, repairs for a Guildhall ceiling. All of London seemed to demand rebuilding these days, though much of it was patchwork on old bones. He hated walking this late. The lanes grew mean after midnight, shadows pooling in every alley. Men in cloaks waited with hungry eyes, and Thomas had little more than his hammer for comfort. Still, it was the only hour he had for himself. He carried a scrap of bread in his pocket, saved from supper, and chewed it slowly as he walked. The air tasted strange tonight, sharp, unsettled. He paused on the rise of Fish Street Hill and looked east. Over the roofline, a glow rose faintly, like dawn in the wrong quarter of the sky. He frowned, then told himself it was nothing more than a tavern fire, or a smith working too late. Fires broke out often enough, and they were put down quickly by buckets and ladders. Still, the sight lodged in his chest like a splinter. He walked on, boots scuffing against the stones. At the top of the hill he stopped again. The glow was stronger now. The wind whipped up the street, tugging his cloak and carrying with it the acrid tang of smoke. Not hearth smoke, not the sweet smell of coal or wood. This was harsher, stinging his throat. God's teeth, Thomas muttered, and quickened his pace. He passed a watchman slumped against a post, staff in hand, half asleep. The man roused himself as Thomas approached. What hour? Thomas asked. 2:30, the watchman grunted. His eyes flicked eastward. See that? Thomas nodded. The two men stood a moment in silence, watching the glow deepen. Then the watchman spat. It'll come to nothing. They always do. But as Thomas turned into his own alley, he could not shake the sense that the city was holding its breath. The houses leaned closer, their beams creaking in the wind. Somewhere a dog barked, frantic, then fell silent. He climbed the narrow stair to his chamber above the workshop, but he did not undress. Instead he sat at the window, elbows on the sill, staring east. The glow was brighter still, and smoke smeared the stars. Thomas Gray did not yet know that the life he had measured in beams and shavings and hammerstrokes would be reshaped by that glow, that by the week's end the city he knew would lie in ashes. For now, he only leaned out the window, sniffed the strange wind, and whispered to himself. Something's coming. Chapter 3: The Lord Mayor's Bedchamber. The knock at Sir Thomas Bloodworth's door came like a hammer blow, sharp enough to rattle the panel. He groaned and pulled the coverlet higher about his shoulders. His chamber was richly furnished, silken hangings, carved oak chairs, a turkey carpet at the foot of the bed, but it felt cold in the small hours. The knocking persisted. Your worship, a voice called. The city's alight. Bloodworth sat up, squinting at the pale face of his servant, who stood trembling in the doorway, wig askew. Behind him, another figure pressed close, a watchman, cloak reeking of smoke. Alight. Bloodworth rasped. What nonsense is this? Fire, sir, at Pudding Lane. The watchman pushed forward, hat clutched in both hands. Beg pardon, my lord. It spreads fast. The wind drives it, and the houses catch like straw. We need orders for demolition. Bloodworth rubbed his eyes. He had been drinking claret at supper and his head ached. Demolitions, at this hour? You'd have me answer to every merchant whose house you pull down? No, no. But, sir. Bloodworth rose, fumbling for his gown. He was a stout man, red-faced, with the air of one long accustomed to comfort but unaccustomed to urgency. He moved to the window. Beyond the rooftops, a glow pulsed against the sky. At first it looked like dawn, though the hour was wrong. Then he saw the smoke, a dark river churning westward on the wind. He frowned. How many houses? Dozens already, the watchman stammered. And the warehouses, oil, tallow, pitch. The riverfront's an inferno. Bloodworth's lips pursed. He thought not of danger, but of coin. Every house demolished meant petitions, lawsuits, quarrels with aldermen. His enemies on the council would seize the chance to paint him reckless. He had survived years in politics by caution. Caution would serve him now. It is nothing, he said firmly. A woman might piss it out. The watchman stared at him in disbelief. The servant shifted uneasily, as if ashamed to have brought the matter at all. Bloodworth turned back to his bed. I'll not be dragged into panic. See to it with buckets and engines. Rouse the parish constables. I'll attend to it at a proper hour. But my lord. That will do. The chamber fell silent but for the wind rattling the shutters. The watchman bowed stiffly and left. Bloodworth lay down once more, muttering to himself. A woman might piss it out. A trifle. A common blaze. Nothing more. But outside, the glow thickened, the sky reddening as if the city itself were blushing at his cowardice. Chapter 4: Margaret Henslow's House. The night pressed close around Seething Lane, but within the Henslow house there was warmth, lamplight, and a sense of order Margaret had fought fiercely to keep. The shutters were drawn, the hearth banked, the boy asleep upstairs. Margaret sat at her escritoire, a quill scratching across parchment. She wrote slowly, pausing now and then to flex her fingers. The letter was to her brother in Bristol, a merchant of tobacco, who had offered more than once to take her and Edward into his household. But she would not leave London. London was her husband's city, her son's inheritance. Even after William Henslow had gone to the grave 3 winters ago, Margaret had refused to surrender what he had built, the warehouses on Thames Street, the contracts with Dutch traders, the neat house with its panelled rooms and broad front door. The quill scratched again. She wrote of business, of small triumphs, of Edward's Latin lessons. She wrote little of loneliness. A sound stirred her, wind rattling the shutters. She rose, set down the quill, and checked the latch. The air that slipped through the seam was sharp, tainted with a faint acrid note. She wrinkled her nose but thought little of it. Somewhere, she supposed, a chimney had caught. Such things happened often enough. The parish wardens and bucket men would see to it. She climbed the stair to Edward's room. He lay curled beneath the coverlet, a tangle of limbs, dark hair across his brow. Margaret brushed it back with a mother's tenderness. At 8 years old, he was all she had left of William, his eyes, his stubborn jaw. She kissed him lightly and drew the blanket tighter. Sleep, my darling, she whispered. The world waits for you. Returning to her chamber, she caught sight of the sky through a crack in the shutter. The eastern horizon glowed a deep, unnatural orange. For an instant, she thought it beautiful, like a sunrise painted in haste by some careless hand. Then the wind shifted, carrying with it the unmistakable stench of burning pitch. Margaret frowned. She closed the shutters firmly and told herself she would sleep. Tomorrow she would send word to the warehouse overseer, perhaps remind the aldermen of their duties. The city was always noisy, always unsettled. It was no concern of hers. She blew out the lamp. Darkness settled. But outside, the glow thickened, licking higher into the night, and the first stray sparks rode the wind toward Seething Lane. Chapter 5. The Wind Rises. At first it was only a glow, a smear of amber across the black sky. By the hour before dawn, it was a furnace. Down by the river, Thames Street was a marketplace of fire. Warehouses built cheek by jowl, their timbers fat with tar and pitch, were touched by sparks and answered with roaring flame. Barrels of oil burst like ordnance. Tallow, wax, hemp, every cargo of London's trade fed the blaze as if the devil himself had tallied the inventory. The wind, hard from the east, became a servant of destruction. It plucked burning fragments from the rooflines and tossed them across alleys into new houses, new yards. It rushed through open doors, fanned small flames into giants. The fire no longer spread like a creeping thief, it leapt like a conqueror, taking whole streets in an hour. Thomas Gray had not slept. From the window of his garret he watched the sky pulse red, smoke climbing higher than the spire of St. Magnus. The air was hot even here, 2 streets away. He pulled on his boots and ran down to the lane. Men shouted, stumbling under loads of bedding and furniture. Women carried children on their hips, their skirts already flecked with sparks. The clatter of cartwheels filled the cobbles as merchants tried to haul goods toward safer ground. Thomas joined a knot of apprentices with ladders and buckets, but the water they threw hissed uselessly against walls that were already blazing. Back! Back! Someone cried as a warehouse roof sagged and fell inward with a shriek. The ground shuddered with the crash, and a fountain of sparks shot skyward, falling on men's coats and women's hair. Thomas slapped at his sleeve, his heart hammering. He felt for the first time the true scale of it. This was no house fire. This was the city itself on trial. Farther west, Margaret Henslow stood at her chamber window in Seething Lane, Edward at her side, his small hand gripping hers. She had told herself the night before that it was nothing, a common blaze. But now the sky glowed as though dawn had risen in the wrong quarter. The smell was unmistakable, burning resin, fat, oil, a stench thick enough to sting the eyes. "Mother," Edward whispered, "is it coming here?" Margaret forced her voice steady. "Not if we're quick." She shut the shutters with a snap and turned into the house. Already her mind was working, the chest with coin and plate, the strong box of papers, Edward's cloak. She moved with a speed born of necessity, the practiced calm of a widow who had learned there was no one else to depend upon. Yet beneath it ran a thread of fear, that all she had clung to, wealth, respectability, the Henslow name, was as fragile as any timber beam now smouldering on Thames Street. Above them, the wind shrieked through the chimneys. It sounded like laughter. Chapter 6. River of Fire. By sunrise the city seemed bewitched. The eastern sky was not gold with dawn but black with smoke and red with flame, as if the sun had been torn open too early. Margaret Henslow hurried down Seething Lane with Edward's small hand clamped in hers. A chest with coin and plate weighed her arms, dragging at her every step. Behind her, 2 servants struggled under blankets and bundles, their faces streaked with soot. The streets boiled with people. Furniture teetered on carts, dogs snapped at one another in the crush, chickens flapped madly from cages as their owners shoved through the press. The air was thick with shouts. "Make way, to the river, God save us all." They reached Thames Street, but it was no longer a place of trade. The warehouses had become furnaces. Heat roared in waves so fierce that Margaret felt her skin tighten. Roofs collapsed with thunderous cracks, sending up fountains of sparks. Oil streamed along the gutters in burning ribbons. The stench of tallow made her gag. Edward buried his face against her gown. "Mother." "Hold fast," she whispered, though her own voice quavered. At the wharf, chaos reigned. Bargemen shouted from their boats, their oars slapping the river. 6 shillings for passage. 10 for the pair. Double for your bundles. Families begged and wept, thrusting coin purses toward the water. A woman tried to lower her baby into a boat and was struck away by the boatman's oar. Another man leapt from the quay and clung to a barge until he was beaten off into the water. Margaret pressed forward, shoving Edward ahead of her. She thrust a silver cup into the hands of a waterman, her voice sharp with desperation. "Take us." The man weighed it, then jerked his head. "Hurry." She pushed Edward into the boat, her own legs trembling as she climbed down. But before her servants could follow, another family surged forward, hurling themselves onto the planks. The boat rocked dangerously, the waterman swearing. "Enough. No more." "Wait," Margaret cried, reaching back for her chest of coin. The waterman shoved off with his pole. She stumbled into the boat just as sparks rained down around them. One struck her sleeve and burned a small hole through the fabric. The barge slid into the current. Margaret clutched Edward to her breast and looked back at Thames Street. The warehouses blazed like pyres. Above them, the wind carried fiery brands into the city's heart. She knew, with a chill deeper than the river water, that her house, her name, her life as she had known it were already ash. On the north bank, Thomas Gray fought through the press of bodies. He had joined a line of men carrying buckets, but the water hissed uselessly against the inferno. Then a warehouse roof gave way with a roar, timbers crashing around him. For a moment he thought he would be buried alive. He staggered free, coughing, his hands blistered from heat. Through the smoke he glimpsed the river, 1,000 souls surging toward its promise of escape, barges rocking under the weight of London's fear. And overhead, sparks wheeled like a storm of firebirds, leaping street by street into the west. London was not fighting a fire anymore. London was drowning in it. Chapter 7: Flames across the bridge. London Bridge had always seemed eternal, a spine of stone stitched with houses, its shops leaning out over the water as if peering at their own reflections. That morning it looked mortal, frail as a ribcage lit from within. Smoke crawled along the rooftops, flames licked the timber galleries like hungry tongues. Thomas Gray arrived at the head of Fish Street Hill to find the roadway jammed. Carts stuck axle to axle, people pressed between wheel and wall, apprentices with poles trying to clear a path and failing. The wind ran straight through the street like an alleyway for devils, driving sparks into thatch and eaves. A shower of embers fell and the crowd broke, half surging back into the city, half toward the bridge in blind animal motion. Back, a constable bawled, red-eyed, his leather bucket swinging uselessly from his fist. Back, I say. The houses on the north side are alight. They were more than alight. A bakery sign, an angel with gilded bread in its arms, burned like a small sun and dropped, clanging, to the stones. A boy screamed, trapped between a cart and a door. Thomas shouldered in, heaved the cart's corner up, and yanked him free by the collar. The boy stumbled away without a word, mouth open on nothing. The bridge gatehouse loomed ahead, its teeth of portcullis black with smoke. Beyond, Thomas could see a strip of clear roadway, a miracle on the south side. The lanes had been kept bare since the last great blaze. That firebreak, left by misfortune years ago, looked now like providence. Make for the middle, someone shouted. The houses burn on the north. Keep to the south wall. It was sense, it was also impossible. People poured through the arch in waves. A woman dropped a chest and sank to her knees as the weight left her arms, sobbing in relief or despair, Thomas could not tell which. He climbed the chest like a step to see over the press. What he saw took breath and anger both. The northern row of bridge houses had become a single, continuous flame front. Windows belched fire, rooflines sagged. Shutters glowed from within like coals in a grate before bursting into white heat. Here and there, merchants leaned from upper windows, flinging linens and ledgers, anything, into the roadway or into waiting blankets strung between men. A gust struck and the whole facade breathed, exhaling a wave of hot air that rolled over the bridge like surf. Down, someone bellowed. Thomas threw himself flat as a timber beam leapt outward and crashed across the road, scattering sparks. People scrambled, tripped, crawled under or over the smoking length of it. He rose with the rest, coughing black, and found himself staring into the eyes of a girl his own age, a laundress by her reddened, raw hands, who clutched a bundle against her chest as if it were a baby. She shook her head once, very small, then let him push her bodily toward the clear strip by the south parapet. The river below made a suck-tooth sound as burning shards fell in. Boats jammed the water, skiffs, barges, wherries, oars knocking, watermen cursing, refugees half standing in terror at every shower of sparks. Toward the middle arch he spotted a barge he thought he recognized by the patched stripe along its gunwale and the shoulders of the waterman poling broad, tattooed like a man he'd hired once when the workshop had to fetch beams from the Southwark timber yard. That barge carried a woman and a child huddled together amid bundles. The woman's bonnet had a tear in it, a ribbon flapping like a broken nerve. He didn't know her, he would learn her name later. For now he only saw the way she wrapped her arms around the small boy, making of herself a wall, and he admired it because it was the sort of courage he understood, the kind that held still. A sound like canvas ripping but made of stone tore through the air. Thomas looked up. The timbered overhang above a shop called the Mermaid had given way, a whole corner of the building tilted, groaned, and came down in a skein of flaming planks. The crowd bucked. A man went under. Thomas lunged without thinking, caught the fellow's sleeve, and hauled him sideways. The man's hat went the other way and burned where it fell. Bless you, the man coughed, then vomited black water onto the stones and stumbled on. They reached the bridge's spine. Here, the south parapet gave a measure of shelter from the heat. The air stank of pitch, of cooked oak, of wet wool. Someone had tried to douse a bale and made a stew of it. Above, the sky was a lid turned red inside. Gunpowder, a voice cried from somewhere back in the city. Where are the king's men? Blow the houses, blow them. Thomas couldn't see the king, or anyone with authority. What he saw was a chain of ordinary people passing buckets, passing children, passing the aged along as if they were bricks in a wall against the fire. An old woman with no teeth set her jaw and took a baby from a stranger with more care than if it were gold. Men shouted orders no one had given them. A priest with his cassock hitched up to his knees heaved at a door with his shoulder until his face purpled. A gust came like the flat of a hand. A thatch across the way sparked and went up, and with it the planked gallery outside a haberdasher's. The gallery hung, sagged, dumped a rain of embers, and dropped into the river like a collapsing star. Down below, boatmen shoved frantically, trying to keep open water between themselves and the falling pieces. On the barge Thomas had noticed, the waterman jabbed his pole, fighting current and crowd. A flaming rafter swung loose from high above and scythed downward. The woman on the barge hunched over the boy. The rafter struck the water astern, sending up a sheet of steam and spray that peppered them with soot and cinders. The barge wobbled. Someone shrieked. The waterman yelled something like a prayer and a curse married in one word and shoved again. The boat slid under the arch, momentarily protected, then out into a hail of falling sparks. Grey, a voice shouted behind Thomas, a fellow apprentice from the yard, eyes wild. Back the way we came, she'll take the north houses next. We'll be trapped. South side. Thomas shouted back, pointing. Keep to the wall. They shoved along the parapet, bodies wedged so tight he could feel the ribs of the man in front through his coat. Heat roared. For a delirious second Thomas thought he heard singing and realized it was roof joists keening as they warped. The gatehouse at the bridge's southern end came into view, a darker rectangle through smoke. Beyond it, the road opened onto Southwark's broader ways, and the promise only that of air one could breathe without pain. The crowd sensed escape and surged. That was when the wind failed them by changing its mind. It snatched a whole burning shutter from a window on the north and pitched it into the middle of the road, where it landed like a fallen door and broke open, scattering brands. A boy went down among them, his shirt catching. His mother threw herself on him with both hands, beating at the flames with her palms. Thomas vaulted the shutter and dragged the boy out by his ankles. The mother clawed at him like he were a thief until she realized what he had hold of, then seized her son and sobbed those terrible thank yous that are mostly air. He looked at his hands. The skin on the back of them had gone shiny and tight. He flexed and felt the sting like needles doing honest work. Move, someone screamed in his ear. Move, God rot you. They moved, a human tide. Through the southern arch, into breathing. On the far side, men with axes chopped at a derelict shed to make a firebreak, their faces set in the humorless, prayerless concentration of men who knew their own house was 3 cuts away. Thomas stumbled clear of the press and put his palms on his knees, coughing until something in his chest unlatched and let breath in. He turned back to look. From Southwark's bank, London Bridge was a silhouette of bone. Where houses had been, there were torches. Where shops had leaned, there were gaps like missing teeth. Flames ran along the balustrades, chasing one another as if playing children's games. In the river, boats made jittering shadows under the arches, bobbing, colliding, shoving apart. There was the patched gunwale again. The barge slewed broadside as a whirl in the current caught it. The waterman swore and jammed his pole. The woman with the torn bonnet held the child's face to her stomach as if she could push him back into her body and keep him there. Another rain of sparks fell, little pains, little burns, and the boy lifted his head and blinked at the sky as if it were snow. Keep low, Thomas shouted without knowing he was speaking to them, to anyone. Keep low and cover your mouths. The wind carried the words away and brought him others. Southwark's catching. God help us, it's jumped the river. He wheeled. A row of sheds along the bank had begun to smoulder, the brands from the bridge had found purchase in a roof that had been starved of water for a dry month. Men ran with buckets, women slapped at sparks on cloth with bare hands. A child stamped on an ember as if it were a beetle and yelped. Thomas looked up and down the bank for any shape of order, any sign of men directing men, and found none. Perhaps the king would come with his guards and his gunpowder. Perhaps the aldermen would find their spine. What he had, now, was his own 2 hands and the weight they could carry. Grey. He turned. His master's son, Will, face black as a sweep, had found him. We're for the wharf, Mr. Harrow's place is going. They've ladders. Come. Thomas nodded once, hard. He took 3 steps after Will, then stopped and looked back at the bridge one last time. The woman's barge had cleared the arches and was angling toward the Surrey shore. The waterman's shoulders worked like a mill. The boy's head was turned toward the city, watching it burn the way children watch storms because they cannot yet believe in their own smallness. Thomas dragged his gaze away. A shop sign flamed and fell and flung up sparks that made a new constellation in the hot air. He ran. Behind him, London Bridge lifted its voice with the rest of the city, a long, tearing sound that had no words in it at all. Chapter 8, The King's Messenger. Samuel Pepys awoke with a start, his chamber thick with smoke though no fire touched Seething Lane yet. He drew on his robe and flung open the window. To the east, the sky glowed the color of a forge. The wind drove sparks in sheets across the rooftops. He heard shouting in the street below. Families fled with bedding and pots slung over their shoulders. One man dragged a chest, spilling silver cups across the cobbles as he stumbled. The air stank of tar and burning fat. Pepys wrapped a scarf over his mouth and stepped into the lane. His neighbor clutched at his sleeve. The whole riverside's alight. The warehouses are gone, the bridge half ruined. If the wind holds, the exchange itself will catch. Pepys knew what that meant, ruin, not only for London but for England's commerce. He turned and ran, not east toward the fire, but west, toward Whitehall. Through smoke and chaos he pushed, dodging carts and weeping children. His diary later would set it down in calm words, but in this moment his heart thundered with fear. All of London may be lost. All of it. At Whitehall, soot-faced and panting, he knelt before King Charles II. Sire, the city burns. Unless houses be pulled down to make firebreaks, it will never be stopped. The king's dark eyes were steady. He glanced to his brother, the Duke of York. Then we must do it, Charles said simply. If the mayor will not, then we will. Chapter 9, A City in Panic. On Thames Street, the air was hotter than any summer. Margaret's barge had made land near Queenhithe, but the quay was no refuge. Flames chased them, roofs exploding, whole houses collapsing into the river with hisses of steam. She pulled Edward close and tried to find her servants in the mob, but they were gone, swallowed by the tide of bodies. Men shouted in foreign tongues, barges collided, women screamed for children lost in the smoke. Rumor raced faster than flame. The French, someone cried. The Dutch. They've set the city ablaze. Margaret saw a foreign sailor dragged from his horse and beaten bloody on the stones. Another man pointed at a limping figure, Robert Hubert, and shouted, "A papist spy." The mob surged, fists and knives raised. Margaret turned Edward's face away, trembling. The city was not only burning, it was tearing itself apart. Chapter 10, The Lord Mayor's Shame. Near Guildhall, Sir Thomas Bloodworth stumbled through the ash-choked streets, his fine cloak dragging in suit. Citizens pressed around him, begging for orders. "My lord, we must pull down the houses. My warehouse burns, give us leave to firebreak. For God's sake, act, man." Bloodworth waved them off, sweat pouring down his face. "I cannot, there will be lawsuits. Compensation, this is not lawful." A woman spat at him. "Better lawsuits than ashes, you fool." The cry was taken up. "Coward. Useless. Shame." Bloodworth turned away, retreating into the smoke. His city was burning, and he had no answer for it. Chapter 11, Crossing Paths. Cheapside was a river of people. Smoke curled between the gabled houses, sparks fell like angry stars, and every street groaned with the sound of carts pushed too fast and goods dropped in haste. Margaret clutched Edward's hand so tightly that his knuckles whitened. Her skirts snagged on splintered wood as she forced her way forward. The chest of silver and papers she had dragged from Seething Lane was gone, torn from her by the crowd at the quay. All that remained to her was her son and the clothes on her back. "Mother, I can't breathe," Edward gasped. She bent to shield him, pressing his face against her bodice, trying to block the smoke. Her own eyes streamed. All about them people cried out, "St. Paul's will burn, God preserve us." A push from behind nearly toppled her. She staggered and collided with a broad-shouldered youth carrying a hammer at his belt. His shirt was scorched, his face blackened with soot. "Watch yourself," he barked, steadying her with a firm grip. Margaret bristled. She had no time for rough apprentices. "Unhand me. You'll be trampled if I do." His northern accent was sharp as a carpenter's plane. He glanced down at Edward. "You've a child. Stay close. I can manage." Before she could finish, a crash shook the street. A shopfront collapsed, sending a sheet of sparks across the roadway. The crowd screamed and surged backward, crushing them together. Margaret lost her footing, then felt the apprentice's arm seize her firmly, pulling both her and Edward against the wall until the rush passed. When the dust cleared, she realized his body had shielded hers. He released her, stepping back awkwardly. "Name's Thomas Gray. From Fish Street Hill." Margaret drew Edward close, pride warring with gratitude. "Margaret Henslow." Smoke thickened again, blotting out the spires. Somewhere ahead, bells clanged in warning, and the heat grew unbearable. Thomas glanced at her chest to shoulder with a craftsman's eye, measuring her resolve. "You'll not make it alone," he said. "Come with me. I know a way west." Margaret hesitated, she, a merchant's widow of good standing, following a rough carpenter's apprentice. Yet Edward coughed against her gown, and the air pressed hotter. She nodded once, curtly. "Lead on." And so, amid the chaos of Cheapside, a widow and a carpenter's apprentice bound their fates together, the fire driving them as one. Chapter 12, St. Paul's Ablaze. The crowd poured into the churchyard of St. Paul's, clutching their goods as if the stones of the cathedral could shield them. The great spire loomed above the smoke, its ancient bulk a promise of safety. For nearly 600 years it had stood through plague, war, and rebellion. Surely it would stand now. Margaret stumbled into the yard with Edward at her side, Thomas Gray close behind. People spread blankets on the grass, piling chests, trunks, and bundles against the cathedral's walls. Printers and booksellers from Paternoster Row had carried their stock inside, believing the stone vaults fireproof. "Stay near," Margaret murmured to Edward, smoothing his soot-streaked hair. The air was strange here, an uneasy calm under the massive walls, the roar of the fire muffled like thunder heard through hills. Margaret wanted to believe the others, that God's own house would withstand the flames. But Thomas stood a little apart, staring upward. The scaffolding clung to the cathedral's flanks, timber frames for repairs long delayed. The wind caught those planks now, and they rattled like bones. He had worked timber all his life. He knew the sound of wood drying, straining, ready to catch. "Too much scaffold," he muttered. "It's a chimney waiting for fire." As if the fire heard him, a gust drove sparks across the rooftops. A cry went up. The timber had caught. At first it was only a ribbon of smoke, curling lazily upward. Then, with a rush of wind, the scaffolding flared like a torch. Screams tore the churchyard. People abandoned their piles of goods and surged for the gates. The booksellers ran inside to drag their volumes out, only to stagger back as smoke poured through the doors. Thomas seized Margaret's arm. "We must go." But Edward, she pulled her son to her chest, clutching him so tightly he cried out. The fire climbed higher, running up the scaffold like children chasing one another. Flames licked the lead roof. In a moment the sheets softened, sagged, and began to run, molten rivers pouring from the gutters. The air filled with the hiss of hot metal striking stone. The great bell tolled once, not by any ringer's hand but by the fire's fury. Its voice was deep and broken, echoing through the smoke. Then the roof gave way. With a roar like the breaking of the world, the timbers collapsed inward. A column of flame burst skyward, so high it lit the smoke above like false daylight. Fragments of stone flew like grenades, shattering against the ground. People fell to their knees or fled shrieking. Margaret shielded Edward with her body. Heat scalded her face, her skirts smouldering until Thomas struck at them with his hands. "Move," he shouted. "It'll take the whole yard." They stumbled toward Ludgate Hill, pressed by the panicked crowd. Behind them, the cathedral that had crowned London for centuries burned like a pyre. Margaret looked back once. The great rose window shattered outward in a bloom of sparks, as if the very soul of the church had been blown apart. Edward whimpered. "Mother, will it all burn?" Margaret swallowed the taste of ash. "No, my love," she said, though she did not believe it. Beside her, Thomas glanced back as the spire groaned and toppled inward. He gritted his teeth, eyes fierce. If the church could fall, then all could fall. Unless men stood against it. The fire had claimed London's heart. Now it would test its soul. Fire next in line is Chapter 13, Gunpowder Lines, where the King and Duke of York finally order houses blown up to make firebreaks and Thomas joins in the desperate effort. "Would you like me to draft Chapter 13 in the same full novelistic style?" You said. "Yes." ChatGPT said. "Perfect, here's Chapter 13, Gunpowder Lines, in full novelistic prose, carrying us into the desperate turning point when the king finally takes control." Chapter 13, Gunpowder Lines. By the 5th of September, London was a vision out of Revelation. From the river to Cheapside, nothing stood but blackened walls and smoking heaps. The fire had marched westward with the wind, devouring parish after parish, and still it showed no mercy. Thomas Gray staggered along Fleet Street, his lungs raw, his hands blistered from hauling buckets and hacking at doors. The air tasted of iron and ashes. He had slept scarcely an hour in 2 days, yet something fierce kept him moving, the knowledge that if men stopped, the city was truly lost. At Ludgate he saw them, soldiers of the king, musketeers with powder kegs on their shoulders, marching grimly toward the fire's edge. At their head rode the Duke of York, his face smeared with soot, his cloak torn by sparks. The Duke dismounted and shouted above the roar, "Bring the powder forward. Set the charges along the lane, blow down the houses." There was a stunned silence. Citizens gaped at him as if he had gone mad. Blow up their own homes. But the Duke's men were already at work, hammering powder charges against walls, stuffing them into cellars, laying trails of matchcord. Thomas found himself pressed into the labor, hauling timbers, dragging families from their cottages. One woman clutched her silverware to her breast and shrieked as soldiers smashed her shutters. "They'll ruin us," she cried. "Better the fire than this." Thomas seized her wrist. His voice was hoarse, but it cut through her panic. "Madam, the fire will take it all. At least this way we stand a chance." Her eyes burned with hatred, but she let him pull her away. Moments later the first charge thundered. A house crumpled inward, beams snapping, walls collapsing in a cloud of dust. For an instant the fire rushed forward hungrily, then stalled, licking at the wreckage but finding no fuel beyond. The soldiers cheered. The Duke raised his sword. "More powder. Bring them down, every house from here to the temple." Thomas joined a line of apprentices swinging axes at doorposts, widening the gap. Sweat and soot streaked his face, his arms trembling with exhaustion. Yet he felt a strange exultation. At last, men were not merely fleeing, they were fighting. Through the smoke he glimpsed Margaret and Edward, crouched by the roadside with others. Edward's small face was pale, his lips cracked. Margaret met Thomas's eyes and gave a single nod, gratitude, or perhaps trust. It steeled him more than any command. Another charge went off, the ground shuddering underfoot. Houses fell like dominoes, leaving a ragged wound of rubble across the lane. Beyond it, the fire roared, striking at the gap like a beast foiled of its prey. But for the first time in 4 days, the fire did not advance. It snarled, it spat sparks, but the line held. Thomas dropped his hammer and leaned against a broken wall, chest heaving. Around him, men coughed and wiped their eyes, staring at the smouldering gap they had carved with powder and sweat. "God help us," Thomas whispered, half to himself. "We might yet save what's left." Farther down the lane, the king himself appeared, tall and dark-haired, his eyes keen even through the smoke. He raised a hand, not as a monarch but as a man among men, and shouted, "Courage! Hold fast! London shall rise again." And for a moment, amid the ruins, they believed him. Chapter 14, The Refugee Camps. The fire no longer galloped, it smouldered, prowling at the edges where powder and axes had hacked a wound across the city. Yet for tens of thousands, the damage was already done. Their houses lay in ash, their shops collapsed, their treasures scattered or looted. North of the city walls, Moorfields had become a sea of the dispossessed. By day, smoke lay on it like fog. By night, a forest of makeshift tents flickered in the glow of embers. Margaret Henslow stepped onto the field with Edward's hand locked in hers. Around them stretched a vision she had never imagined, noblemen's wives huddled under canvas beside beggars, apprentices curled in the open air, whole families crouched around small fires, trying to cook scraps of bread or roots scavenged from the market gardens. Edward clutched at her gown. Mother, where do we go? Margaret forced her voice calm. Here, for now. Until we find a house. They wove through the camp. A child wailed for water. A man coughed blood into a rag. Margaret tried not to see, not to hear, but the misery pressed close from every side. She found a patch of bare ground by a hedge and lowered Edward to sit. From the bundle on her shoulder she unwrapped what little she had saved, a crust of bread, half a dried apple, a pewter cup. She broke the bread and pressed a piece into Edward's hands. He ate greedily, crumbs clinging to his soot-blackened lips. Margaret took nothing for herself. Nearby, a woman shrieked her baby was gone. Others joined the search, calling through the tents. Margaret clutched Edward tighter, heart hammering. In a city without walls, with no law but desperation, a child could vanish as easily as a coin dropped in the street. Later, as dusk fell, men from the King's Guard rode into the camp, distributing loaves and casks of beer. The crowd surged, hands clawing, voices begging. Margaret stood back, unwilling to fight like an animal, but when Edward whimpered she forced herself forward, elbowing through until a soldier thrust a loaf into her arms. God keep you, she whispered, though he did not hear. That night, lying on the hard ground with Edward curled against her, Margaret listened to the camp, coughing, murmured prayers, quarrels breaking out over scraps. The smell of smoke still clung to the air, and the sky glowed faintly red where the fire smoldered. She closed her eyes, but sleep would not come. She thought of her house on Seething Lane, its panelled walls, her escritoire, the chest of silver she had clung to. Gone. All gone. Pride had been her armor, now it was ash. She had only Edward left, and she swore silently that she would keep him alive, whatever the cost. At the far edge of the camp, she glimpsed a figure moving among the tents, carrying water buckets, helping the sick. Even in the dim glow she knew him, Thomas Gray, the carpenter's apprentice. His shoulders sagged with exhaustion, yet he moved with a purpose that steadied her. For the first time in days, Margaret felt a flicker of something she thought lost. Not hope, not yet, but the memory of it.